Hello, Rune Scholar, wherever and whenever you are. I'm the modern Erilar. In my last episode, I described a fundamental decision to make when you're writing in runes, choosing a writing direction. So today, let's discuss another fundamental decision, the spatial arrangement of your text as a whole. While we usually read modern English from left to right and from top to bottom, this is not necessarily how runes have been written. The shape and the composition of the writing surface had a much stronger influence on the placement and direction of application of the runic text than the degree of literacy of the writer, but inscriptions show a variety of more or less influence from Latin literacy, depending upon the location and the date of the inscription. And runes do seem to have tended to be applied in different ways in different geographical areas, not all of which even show influence from Latin literacy. So this gives us, as rune writers, a lot of potential options. Many of us write to communicate a text to another person over a distance as part of our daily lives. And for these, we have a couple of options. Many of the wooden rune sticks, or runakefli, have the inscription on one or more flattened sides of a stick, with the staves of the runes within the inscription tending to extend more or less to fill the available vertical space. And that is true whether the inscription is a single word, like in the case of this ownership tag, or within a much longer sequence. And both of these examples have survived from the Bryggen site in Bergen. From the medieval period, we also know that rune writers sometimes used wax tablets made either of wood or antler, where a shallow depression had been scraped out and the hollow filled with wax, into which runes could be cut with a stylus. And from the texts on these, it looks like they wrote in rows along the long axis, sort of like it's in landscape mode rather than portrait. Some of us are looking to put runes on jewelry. Inscriptions on bracteates might have runes around the outside edge, like this one from Voldstena, or integrated into a more complex central design. The word allu appears just outside the nose of the face on this inscription from Bjornerud. Most of the inscriptions that we see on weapons from the very earliest phases of runic writing appear on the reverse of the item, so it would have been hidden, like on the Torsberg shield boss that I'm showing here. But runes run along the blade of the Sax of Beagnoth, which I showed you in episode 6 on the Anglo-Saxon Futhorc, so in some cases they were indeed visible. Orientations for carving in wood, whenever it's not just a rune stick, this can be quite versatile. In Lunder Church in Søknadal, a medieval crucifix features an inscription that's divided between 3 different lines. The first appears on Christ's his foreleg, and the second is on the cloth that's covering the top of his leg, and the third part of the inscription actually appears on the right forearm. And the white paint on the background here indicates the placement of these 3 lines that make up the text, just to make it more visible so that you can tell where in the figure the runes are actually oriented, so that you can see it kind of as a whole. Flat surfaces give us a variety of orientations depending upon whether they're movable or immovable. On movable objects like the Ribe skull fragment and the Baconstorp bookmark, the text in each extends around the outer edge of the item, like it does on some of the bracteates. On immovable objects like the Maes Howe inscriptions from the walls inside of the prehistoric chamber grave, or even this inscription from the walls of Hupperstad Church, we do often see lines. So the runes are in individual lines, and in Maes Howe they tended to be horizontal, but here in Hupperstad the inscription is vertical and it's read from bottom to top. Many of us, though, think about rune stones when we're concerned about the spatial orientation of a text, and we do need to think about whether the stone itself is recumbent or if it's raised. In an English context, the so-called pillow stones were placed into graves, and the survivors laid the head of the deceased, and this frequently happened at monasteries. The name presumably of the deceased would appear in runes or in Roman letters, or sometimes both on these particular stones that were kind of a pillow for the head, so that explains the name. And the Hartlepool pillow stone that I'm showing you here has an alpha and an omega towards the top, and in runes, the name Hildethrith is carved below. So this inscription is placed horizontally across the broad face of the stone. So with this being a monastic context, this means that there is inherently some overlap with Latin literate culture, but as we saw from the Lunder crucifix, just because it's Christian doesn't mean that the text necessarily conforms to Latin practice. If we look at recumbent stones in Scandinavia, many show inscriptions that are around the edges rather than across the face. This recumbent stone from Söderving shows multiple rows along the same long edge of the stone, while others, like the one at Lue Church in Gotland, this has the text going around the outside edge again. Inscriptions on raised stones and stone objects show a similar geographic division. When we look at the English material, like the Bewcastle and Ruthwell crosses, the text is broken up into rows on wider surfaces, and these are horizontal and proceed from left to right and typically top to bottom. In Scandinavia, plain inscriptions were predominantly carved vertically rather than horizontally, and we can discern some geographical variation here as well. Rows or bands of inscriptions without further ornamentation are typical for Norway, Denmark, and some areas in southern Sweden, by which I mean Västergötland, Östergötland, and Småland. Danish carvers tended to choose the broad face of the stone for their inscriptions, or a broad face in general, and the inscriptions could run upwards or downwards, or in the case shown here, it could be either. I mentioned boustrophodon in my last episode, that as the ox plows orientation, and the runes here are set inside framing lines that define the individual bands within the inscription. Norwegian carvers tended to prefer carving on narrow edges of the stone. So while you do get some that show multiple bands, they tended not to even need framing lines for their inscriptions. And their runes almost always run from the ground upwards on the stone. In Uppland and Södermanland, the inscription is frequently contained within the body of a serpent or a sweeping curved band that strongly resembles a serpent or another type of zoomorphic figure. I know several of you will be interested that Anne-Sophie Kreislund has a good analysis organizing zoomorphic design elements into a chronology, but that's more about the art than about the Futhark, so I won't cover it myself here, but I will cite her work in the further readings section that I always provide at the end. On Gotland, we know the famous picture stones, which only sometimes have an inscription, and the inscription tends to be around the outside edge of the mushroom-shaped stone, and sometimes there are horizontal bands integrated into the design, like this one from Runhem. We do have notable exceptions to the trend for verticality on rune stones, though. The Björketorp stone, which is still Scandinavian, has a text that is carved horizontally in rows that are read from left to right, though the lines are read from the bottom upwards. So, as always, there are trends, but almost none of them are completely exclusive. There did exist a tendency towards a more linear character in contexts that suggest a book-learned literacy. I already mentioned the recumbent grave slabs, but we also see runic texts on church bells and lead amulets, like this one that I described in my episode on the Baltic Islands. Many of these Latin-influenced texts show multiple characteristics of Latin influence, and the Tingvoll inscription is a quintessential example of a runic inscription from someone who has comprehensively adopted elements of Latin script culture into their writing. This person uses double consonants, bind runes that resemble the ligatures found in manuscripts, and the whole thing is arranged in 4 rows situated on drawn double lines inside of a rectangle, so it looks very much like a book. The vast majority of runic inscriptions, though, even during the Middle Ages, still show an approach to organization that differs from Latin concepts of text organization. One often has to turn either the object that bears the inscription or one's head, sometimes many times, in order to be able to read effectively. And that can be integral even to the interplay of the message within the ground on which it appears. When some lines on the Swedish runestones intersect, the framing lines can serve as staves for other runes. And we can see that here in the name Tofa, with this rune here, and in the word Hjalpi, with these 2 runes here. And there's a lot more to the decisions about framing lines, so let's discuss that more in our next episode. Hopefully now you have a bunch of good options for the layout of your own runic text. So thank you for writing the runes with me, the modern Erilar.